Hi everyone, this is Cindy back with our third segment of our session called Enacting Hope, using the storytelling for social justice model to support youth participatory action research. You'll remember in the first part of our session, which was called Igniting Hope, Molly talked, and I did too, about how essential the framework and the practices associated with sustainable teaching have become for us for supporting the equity work that we've been doing with students and teachers over the past many years. And like Molly explained, sustainable teaching has allowed us to walk toward a different narrative than the narrative that's surrounding us at work and just really the world at large. We have become even more convinced that equity work has to start with ourselves. And for women from a white middle class background of privilege, that has meant for us that we have to do some really hard critical reflection and self discovery before we can move into community to do that equity work. Because when we have tried to leapfrog the self work and headed straight into those high stakes C's that we talked about to fight for social justice, we absolutely have gotten swept up into that narrative of busyness that Molly talked about, and we've burned out. And that's the same thing that the story we've heard over and over with the teachers that we work with. So, what we've learned is that we really have to have access to those low stakes islands where we can practice sustainable teaching. And that's why the definition itself emphasizes educators first. That is not a selfish act, it's the act that allows us to do the work that we really care about that makes a transformation of the world. In the second part of the session, which was called Embodying Hope, Molly really focused on that interior work that we have to do. And she talked about it and the importance of tending to our body, to honoring the wisdom of our body, all the way down to our nervous systems, all the way down to that vagus nerve. In the process of working through the trauma that we and our students experience and encounter as educators. We've discovered that sustainable teaching really helps us with this, but it goes way beyond mindfulness and way beyond self care. Those tools are part of the process and the practices of sustainable teaching, but they really aren't the whole story. Sustainable teaching has really given us permission to go into the cave, as Molly was describing it, to spend some time there in solitude, to do that self reflection, because we need that time. And it's not just to recover, but to slow our bodies down and restore. And by restore, we literally mean building up our stores so that we can exit the cave and work in community and solidarity with others so we can respond to our students' needs. And as I said earlier, really transform the world. And that brings us to this last part of our presentation. There's a beautiful quotation by Rebecca Solnit, who wrote Hope in the Dark, which is a book that I cannot recommend strongly enough, that says, hope is not a prize or a gift, but it's something you earn through study. That's what we're talking about with that cave work. Through resisting the ease of despair and through digging the tunnels, cutting windows, opening doors, or finding the people who do these things. They exist. So, the work that I'm going to give you an example of today, this really concrete work, is putting hope into action. It's not just being hopeful that hope still exists out there somewhere. It does exist. And it happens when we combine these ideas of the cave that Molly talked about with another concept that I'm going to talk about in this section of the presentation called hospitable spaces. And that work has really come out of the research that we've done on sustainable teaching over the years. So before we move on to that, I would like for you to pause this presentation. If you don't have access to something to write with and write on, you're going to need that. So grab those materials like you did earlier in the session and pause the video if you need to. And then I'm going to ask you to do a bit more work. Okay, in this section, of the presentation, we're going to focus on 4 things. That interior work that I was talking about, the collective support that's needed through these hospitable spaces, and that's where we're going to start. We're going to talk about hospitable spaces. I'm going to name one in that Colorado State Sustainable Teaching and Learning Collaborative. We're going to talk about something called the Storytelling for Social Justice framework, and then what are the connections among these things: sustainable teaching, social justice and story, and youth participatory action research. All right, so here's where you need your paper and your pen or your pencil. What I'd like for you to do right now is to draw a general floor plan of your school and the spaces right outside the exterior. This doesn't have to be an architectural blueprint at all. Just very quickly draw what those spaces look like. Be sure to leave some space around the outside, the perimeter of the building, that will give you just a little more space with those surrounding physical boundaries. And you don't have to draw everything, just think about what the spaces are outside of those. Okay, I'm going to give you a few moments to just pause your screen and make a sketch. Okay, the next thing that I'd like for you to do is you can do this on a separate piece of paper, or you can just turn that page over that has the floor plan on it now. And I'd like for you to make a 2-column chart. And on one side of it, label teachers on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side of your chart, put the label students at the top. And here's what I want you to think about. This goes back to the earlier part of the presentation, the very first part of our session. What we'd like for you to do is to locate and label those low stakes islands and the high stakes seas that exist for teachers in your school and its surrounding boundaries. And just remember, the low stakes islands are the places where you can go, where you can be vulnerable, you can ask questions, you can be in community with others, and it's okay not to have all the answers. It's an exploratory space. Versus the high stakes sea, which is really the performance zone, and that's where we always have to be on. So just label those, locate and label those, and use a shark fin to mark those high stakes seas, and then a plus sign to mark the low stakes island. So I'll give you a second just to do that. Okay, now we're going to move on. So if you need a bit more time, just feel free to pause the video. But the second thing that we would like for you to think about is, what are the characteristics of those spaces? And so you can just label your diagram just with a few words or phrases, just jot down those characteristics. Okay, if you need more time, feel free to pause again. And then let's move on to number 3. Use a star to indicate spaces where you can really feel that your sustainable teaching is fostered, like we talked about in that first section, in that first session. What are the characteristics of those spaces? Jot those down too. Okay, if you need a bit more time, feel free to pause the video, but I bet you can guess where we're headed next, which is to do the exact same thing with your students. I will ask you to pause here just to go through that exact same process. And then when you get to the last item on this list for the students, use an X to indicate spaces, not for sustainable teaching, obviously, but we want to think about spaces where your students' needs are really being met, not just as learners, but as human beings overall. And think too about the characteristics of those spaces and jot those down. So take just a few minutes to do that, and feel free to pause the video. Okay, now I'd like for you to just set that aside. We're going to come back to those materials later. I want to focus on just give you a little preview of the things that we're going to focus on in this the remainder of this session. So one, what are hospitable spaces anyway? So hospitable spaces, and as I said, this comes directly out of the research that we've done over a number of years on sustainable teaching. The first characteristic of it is this idea of intellect without pretense, right? So people can be smart together. We can figure out hard things together, but you do not have to be the smartest person in the room. This is a low stakes island, so you can explore and you can ask questions out of this position of generativity and generosity. So it's that curious space that we talked about earlier. There's a sense of curiosity, welcoming, openness, this idea that not only can we figure out hard things, but we can do hard things together and we can be real with one another in the process. And then the third piece of it, even though we're figuring out these hard things and doing these hard things, there's actually a quality of emotional buoyancy in those spaces. So we're able to struggle through together because this becomes a space of joy. So it's not just a space of pain and struggle, it's also a space of joy, a space of hope, and a space where we can heal together. So here's what I would like for you to do. Grab those the floor plan and the two-column chart that you made for just a moment ago, and I'd like for you to look through those spaces again and think about where are the hospitable spaces for you and your colleagues, and also for students at your school. So just think about those three qualities: intellect without pretense, generativity and generosity, emotional buoyancy. Where do those exist for you and your colleagues and your students at your school? Do they even exist? Either way, though, what are the implications of that fact, and what work really needs to be done so that you can have those hospitable spaces in your and your students' lives? So pause the video, write about that for just a moment, and then we'll move on to the next section. All right, now that you've thought about hospitable spaces and I've told you the qualities of them, I want to give you a concrete example in something that's called the Colorado State Sustainable Teaching and Learning Collaborative, which we pronounce as CASTLE. And it really is a hospitable space. This is part of a project, some work that I've been doing for over the past couple of years that's been really generously funded by Colorado State University. It contains these three overlapping components. So there's this, if you're looking at the blue circle on the right-hand side, these are the people who are involved in really thinking about and developing a sense of sustainable teaching and learning. We've got CSU, we have teachers, many of whom are CSU alumni, but they're teachers from across the state, both rural and urban educators from across the state, a small cohort. And then we have a couple of students from each of those teachers, so rural and urban youth all together in the same space, and what we're calling CSU-Y partners. And those are undergraduate students who serve as mentors for the rural and urban youth. The thing that makes this project really unique is that it is a space for youth participatory research. So you see that in the yellow circle on the left. And there's a lot of work that's been done with YPAR in urban settings, a lot less work that's been done in rural settings, but there's really nothing that has brought rural and urban youth together in the same room to do research on the experiences of youth in their schools and communities. So that's something that makes this project unique. Teachers are also inquiring into this work, and then the CSU-Y partners, the student mentors, are doing some autoethnography and reflecting on their experiences with the youth. All this, though, is geared toward civic action, and this is where the community work comes in. So we're doing a lot of interior work in the space of collective support so that we can move out into our schools and communities and take action. Also, in the process, working to transform our actual profession. And this started in spring 2021. So you can just see a timeline here. We've established that cohort of rural and urban teachers across the state. This summer, or last summer, we had an equipping institute that I'll tell you about a little bit more in just a moment. And we are in this really wonderful space right now where we are bringing the students on board. And then we have the to infinity and beyond, because the work will begin expanding regionally. Starting next summer, I'll be recruiting in the spring. So if you're interested in that work at all, please don't hesitate to email me. And then beyond, the work will move to a national level. The question that we're centering our inquiry on is this one. What does it look like to enact social justice in a post-pandemic world? We got post in parentheses there because we are not there yet, my friends. As much as we would love to be, we're hopeful, but we're not there yet. And that question is really framed by these particular principles. As we do our research, it's rooted in community. It's rooted in collaboration in those hospitable spaces. We are leading with hope. We are animated by this dedication to equity. We are motivated by critical curiosity. So you can see the hospitable spaces connection there, with a bias toward advocacy, action, and change in the lives of both the educators and the students we're working with. Here is our group of educators. This is the end of the spring. Last year we just did a fun screenshot. You can see that we did our work all last spring over Zoom. We were unable to meet face to face, and we built this amazing community together, even in a Zoom space. The things that we focused on in the spring, first of all, we're developing hospitable space, doing a deep dive into sustainable teaching, helping teachers develop some tools and understand the framework, doing it for the purpose of enacting social justice. And we didn't just take that term for granted. We dug into some research and theory on how social justice has been framed, and we identified how we were framing it in our own lives. And we did that work especially through something that Leanne Bell calls the storytelling for social justice framework that I'll talk about in just a moment. In that process, we used a lot of critical literacies over the spring. This I Dream a World, we wrote some poetry together. We did a lot of visualization work. We told stories of our families. We dedicated our work to someone who was really important to us. We used digital literacies to share what we were thinking about in breakout rooms and on a regular basis over Zoom. We developed those tools. You should recognize that dashboard there. We also created playlists of songs that really inspired us. We created art. We dealt with photography. Folks brought together pictures that brought them joy. Again, this is hopeful work that does involve struggle, but we didn't want to just focus on pain and trauma. And so we also did these beauty trek, what we called a beauty trek, where we went out and captured pictures of things in our environment that gave us joy. So that's just a rundown a bit on the collaborative itself and in our early work, the spring work. But as I said, we really were using this framework called Storytelling for Social Justice, written by Leanne Bell. This book was called Storytelling for Social Justice, Connecting Narrative and the Arts in Anti-Racist Teaching. We read this book together and we worked through the story types that I'll tell you about in just a moment. This is a second edition of a really fantastic book. And in the book, in her framework, she talks about 4 story types. And the first story type is stock stories. These are the stories that you're familiar with. These are the bootstrap stories that if you work hard enough, you can make it rich stories that are connected to Horatio Alger. We've all heard these stories, and they really do explain racial dynamics. They become even more prominent in the pandemic in ways that support the status quo. But we all know that there are different stories in the background, and she calls these concealed stories. Okay, so stories that are also in existence alongside those stock stories, but they're usually in the shadows. They're the personal stories that folks have that are sometimes stories of pain, but also stories of joy, and they provide a really different perspective from that stock story perspective. one of the things that we did as we looked at concealed stories is we watched this really amazing TED Talk by Baratunda Thurston called How to Deconstruct Racism One Headline at a Time. And what he actually did was he looked at newspaper headlines and he diagrammed them to show how within the headlines themselves, you could actually see racial dynamics in place. And as he says here in the highlighted sentences, diagramming the sentences allowed me to diagram the white supremacy, which allowed such sentences to be true. So it revealed those concealed stories in that second story type. And then what we ask our educators to do is to say, okay, you know about stock stories, you know about concealed stories. What's one that you know that gets told about youth and teachers? What's a concealed story that gets told about youth and teachers in your school? And then we got together in breakout rooms and actually compared and looked at patterns across the stories and recorded those in a Padlet. And you can kind of see some of the things that have come out of the stock stories for this particular group. And we also had rural and urban educators working in breakout rooms together because we wanted for them to hear what kind of difference that context makes. You can see some of the things. I just want to really focus on that line at the bottom. There's a stock story that our students are lazy or they don't prioritize school the way that we as teachers think that they should. So that's one of the stock stories that gets told in the schools for this particular breakout group. But then they thought about what are the concealed stories. And this one at the very beginning, really the first sentence that you see there came out with the rural educators in particular. So it really pushed back against that stock story. And in order to prove the reality that the students are working really hard, but that work isn't necessarily the work that's valued in schools. They work on ranches, they work in farms, they use those outside jobs, they support their family, and that's often the priority. So students don't apologize for that. The family comes before school, but it does not mean that students are lazy. In that last bullet point there, this was a comment from one of the urban teachers who worked in this particular breakout group. And she pointed out that her students do school because it's so important to their parents. And so for them, it is really this hurdle or obstacle or box that they just check so they can get through it and hopefully get to those things that are important or exciting to them. So these are the stories that we don't always know, even as educators with our own students. The Castle teachers had actually gone into their schools and communities and collected those stories in order to come up with the pattern there. That third kind then of story type that Leanne Bell talks about in the storytelling for social justice framework are these resistance stories. Now, these are the stories that we often don't hear about in schools. In fact, they're the ones that at this very moment are being suppressed when we think about stories from history that show how people have actually resisted what she calls the isms. They've challenged stock stories. And they fought for these more equal and inclusive social arrangements throughout our history. So these are very out there and evident. As you can see right here, this, of course, is a picture of the high school students from Parkland High School, where there was the school shooting in Florida, and they immediately stepped out and did a March for Our Lives, organized a March for Our Lives protest with the hashtag Never Again. So we asked teachers to do the same thing after we talked about and learned and looked at all these examples of resistance stories. We asked them to go back to their communities to think about what are resistance stories that are told about youth and educators at your site, or they're creating their own stories. How are they pushing back against equity and working for social change? And we again asked them then to get into breakout groups in our Zoom session and talk with other folks, so rural and urban educators were mixed together in these breakout rooms, and to look at similarities and differences that they noticed. So you can see one of the comments here. They saw those patterns of pushing back against inequity. So that was happening across the board. There was usually some kind of event that motivated the action, and often there were some social media elements to it. The similarity there was that in the rural settings, it was primarily the students who were doing the resistance. So this is actually a contrast, but in the urban context, it was actually the educators. And that brings us to the fourth of the story types, which is the emerging transformative stories. These are the stories that haven't been told yet. Here's how Lee and Bell describes them. The new stories that we construct to challenge stock stories, build on and amplify concealed and resistant stories, take up the mantle of anti-racism and social justice work through generating new stories that catalyze contemporary action against racism. And this is our work as what Lee and Bell calls a counter narrative storytelling community. It's the work we're working together to do with rural educators and urban educators and our students through CASTLE. So again, what's the work that those emerging transforming stories do? They critique and resist the stock stories. They build on the concealed and resistant stories in order to envision those alternatives and to have generative strategies that will lead toward change. So what we did was we asked folks to consider what the questions were that emerging and transforming stories pose. And this, again, is based on Lee and Bell's work. What kinds of communities based on justice can we imagine and then work to make real? And what are the stories embedded in those communities? What are the stories that allow us to speak out and act when we see institutional and interpersonal racism in action and other forms of bigotry as well? So at the end of the spring, we asked folks to synthesize all that work that we had done together around building a hospitable space, understanding what sustainable teaching was, thinking about equity and social justice work and what that really means, and then thinking through the four story types and the storytelling for social justice framework. And this was our very last Zoom meeting. You can see our Jamboard here. We asked this question as we look ahead to this Summer Equipping Institute. What is the emerging transformative story that we want to build together in CASTLE? And I'll just give you a second to scan some of the sticky notes that they included in the Jamboard. But I really, really love the one at the bottom that is yellow that says, "The world we live can be built by our choices, not how things have to be." Some of the folks that participated, that are participating in CASTLE right now, said that this work was so incredibly generative for them and sustaining for them, especially coming on the heels of off of remote learning and back to learning in school spaces with masks and so forth. They said it was rough. It is rough, but it's the thing that has kept them going, that sense of community. So we've talked through that hospitable space, given you the example of the CASTLE Collaborative and the social storytelling for social justice framework that we has been foundational for our work. And so what I want us to think now about together are the three things that really bring our entire session together. So this idea of sustainable teaching and learning, which I'll explain in just a moment, social justice and story itself. And then the next element is youth participatory action research. So you can see how we built on what I was just mentioning that we started with in the spring. And in summer 2021, all the educators came together on the CSU campus. There was this one glorious week between the time that we thought, oh, wow, we all have our vaccines, we don't have to wear masks. And by the end of that week, the CDC had said, actually, you got to put your masks back on. But for one whole week, we didn't have to wear masks. We were finally in the same room physically together, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. What we did during that time was we took a deep dive into youth participatory action research. We looked at it conceptually. We thought about the literacy tools that are often used in it and what the actual methodological tools were. And we read a book called Doing Youth Participatory Action Research by Nicole Mira, Antero Garcia, and Ernest Morel. That is really wonderful and draws on some specific work that they did through the Youth Council that's connected with UCLA School of Education. And we read about kind of the case studies that represented, but they also talk about some specific methodological tools. So we drew on those tools from that book and then from other resources that we curated together and actually practiced doing some youth participatory action research strategies ourselves. And my good friend, Dr. Danielle Filipiak, who has done work with Ciphers for Justice, which I encourage you to look up online, and is a professor at University of Connecticut, did a virtual workshop with us to help us imagine or to experience how to get to the root of youth participatory action research questions. And so you can see a visual tool that she asked us to use together that she calls the question tree. The other thing that we did during that time period, we actually asked some participants who had done work in agitation literacies as part of their own work, but they're teachers in Castle, to do a presentation with us. Molly did some more body and breath work with us and dug into that just a bit more. And then we prepared to onboard the Castle scholars after we'd had all those experiences, doing some informal interviewing, question generation, doing some contextual research that connected to demographic statistics and so forth. And one of the last things we did was we drew on those visual tools together, and we created out on the terrace or the courtyard outside of the building where we were meeting these chalk drawings called 3-foot spheres of influence. And this was really our goal, to stand in this space, to breathe together, and then move forward with joy. And that's what we're doing right at this moment. In the academic year, you can see me in the bottom left-hand corner, and I don't know if you can tell how happy I am, but this is like a dream come true in that we have all the educators and the youth in the same room. We've done our best to recruit educators and students from underrepresented populations. Part of those we've allowed the teachers to define what that means at their school site. We have LGBTQ plus youth, we have youth of color, we have youth who identify as neurodivergent from a number of schools across the state. So what are the connections among all this work? As I said, we started with this idea of sustainable teaching, and we're still learning together about what that means and developing resources ourselves as educators who are involved in Castle. Inquiry is at the heart of all of this work through the storytelling for social justice. I talked to you about how teachers collected stories from their own schools and communities. And now the inquiry is really the youth participatory action research, where the students themselves are coming up with questions around what it means to enact social justice in a post-pandemic world in their specific contexts. So the questions are widely varied, and they are working not only in their individual communities, but they've come together as a research community to look at the comparisons and the contrasts between students from underrepresented populations in both rural and urban sites. We're using that tool set, critical literacy tools, very much like the ones that we use with the educators. We're writing a lot. We're doing role playing. We're doing visualization work and so forth. We'll be doing some artist resistance work with them later in the school year. They're learning leadership and advocacy skills so that we can take civic action together. And then the goal of that work is to have the students themselves develop a new theory of change called sustainable learning. Nobody else can do it but the kids themselves. We can speculate about what it looks like for them to learn in sustainable ways in schools, but we really have a lot to learn from them. So Castle has been a space where we are not just hoping that hope is actually alive and well in the world, but we are enacting it. We have the goal of doing that through our inquiry, and through that interior work and the collective action that we're taking together. So I just ask you to go back to that question that Molly asked at the very beginning of the session. What is the narrative that has brought you here today? And what's the narrative you would like to walk towards for yourself and with your students and your colleagues? I encourage you to spend some time looking over the materials that you've written about today and you've drawn and so forth, to think about, actually setting some time aside to write in reaction to that prompt. And here's a quote for you to just inspire you toward that, by Toni Morrison. Make up a story. Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Don't hesitate to reach out. You can look at the emails that Molly posted at the very beginning of our first presentation. We would love to hear from you. Go forward, do good work, do the interior work it takes to lead to collective action.